If you're 58 years old right now and your super balance is sitting around $210,000, you've probably had that sinking feeling already. The comfortable retirement everyone talks about looks like something that happens to other people, not to someone staring at a balance that's a fraction of the $690,000 you keep seeing quoted for a couple. The usual advice leaves you with two options. Live carefully on very little, or keep working into your 70s, hoping the number eventually catches up. That's not the whole picture, and it's the part almost nobody explains properly, mostly because most of the advice out there is written for someone in their 30s, not someone standing 3 or 4 years out from retirement. The retirees who end up comfortable in this country aren't always the ones who earned the most over their working life. A lot of them are the ones who worked out how their super and the age pension actually talk to each other, instead of treating them as two separate accounts that have nothing to do with one another. Get that interaction wrong, and it costs real money, quietly, without you noticing at first. Pick up a few extra shifts without understanding how the system reacts, and you can hand back $5,000 a year in pension without even realizing it. Stretch that across a 20-year retirement, and that's $100,000 gone for nothing more than a misunderstanding about how one payment affects the other. So in this video, I want to walk you through 6 signs that tell you you're actually on track to retire well, even if you feel like you're starting late, including the exact mechanism behind something called the work bonus, which lets some retirees earn extra cash and keep every single dollar of their pension at the same time. Stick around, because the second sign is the one that trips up almost everyone still carrying a mortgage. The first sign is simple. You know your real number, and it's probably not the one the big calculators show you. ASFA, the industry body that publishes retirement benchmarks, says a couple needs $690,000 in super for what they call a comfortable retirement in 2026. That number gets repeated everywhere, on forums, in newspaper columns, in the calculators every super fund pushes you toward. For a lot of people, it feels completely out of reach, especially if you're a few years out and nowhere near it. But here's what almost never gets mentioned alongside it. For many couples, having closer to $499,000 in assessable assets is actually the sweet spot, because that's the level where you still qualify for the full age pension, worth around $47,070 a year combined. Here's the mechanism behind it. Once your assets go over that threshold, the pension doesn't disappear all at once. It tapers gradually, the same way a dimmer switch fades a light rather than flicking it off. For every $1,000 you sit above the threshold, your pension drops by $3 a fortnight, which works out to $78 a year. Keep pushing your balance up from there, and eventually the pension taper wipes the payment out completely. And this is not about relying on the government, even though it can feel that way at first. You paid tax for 40 years to fund this system. Using it well is not a failure. It's just knowing the rules of a game you already paid to play. The same way you'd claim every legitimate deduction at tax time without feeling guilty about it. Now look at what that actually means in cash terms. A couple sitting on $499,000 in super plus the full pension of $47,070 can end up with more reliable annual income than a couple who built up $800,000 and draws 5% a year, which is $40,000, but gets zero pension, because they're over the assets test. The couple with less sitting in super can end up with more money landing in their account every single year and less exposure to a bad run in the market, because more of their income is guaranteed rather than drawn down. That's the real number worth knowing. Not the headline figure from a calculator, but the number where your own savings and the pension work together instead of one cancelling out the other. But knowing that number is close to useless if you're still carrying the one thing that can undo a retirement faster than any market crash. And that's next. The second sign is how you think about debt, because not all debt behaves the same way once you're close to retirement. There's structural debt, like the mortgage on the home you live in. And there's what I'd call friction debt, the credit card balance, the car loan, the buy now pay later account that quietly rolls over every month and never quite gets paid down. They feel similar on paper. Two numbers you owe someone. They are not the same problem, and treating them the same is where people get into trouble. Take Gary. He's 61. He's got $50,000 left on his mortgage at 6% interest and $50,000 sitting in super, earning around 8%. Standard advice says pay off the house first, get rid of the debt, sleep easier. And for a lot of situations, that's fine advice, especially if the debt is weighing on you emotionally as much as financially. Here's the trade-off. Nobody walks you through. If Gary pulls that $50,000 out of super to clear the mortgage, he loses the tax-free compounding that happens inside super once he's over 60. That's not a small thing. Over years, that compounding quietly does more work than the interest he's paying on the mortgage, especially once his super earnings outpace the loan rate, which is exactly the situation Gary is in right now. The real cost shows up later, not now. Someone who enters retirement carrying friction debt, say a $1,200 a month car payment, is locking in a monthly bill they can't easily walk away from once their income drops to a pension or a modest drawdown. Someone who instead uses the downsizer contribution, putting the proceeds from selling the family home toward the mortgage, without touching their core super balance, keeps that compounding intact and enters retirement with far more breathing room and a lot less monthly pressure. If you're a homeowner over 55 working through trade-offs exactly like this one, that's the kind of thing we focus on here on this channel. Subscribe if you want more of it. Clearing debt feels good, and it should. But there's a rule that changed on the 1st of July that could let you put an extra $32,500 into your super this year alone. And most people over 55 have no idea it exists. The third sign is that you know about the carry forward rule, because most people assume the yearly contribution cap is a hard ceiling. It isn't, and that misunderstanding costs people real opportunities every single year. As of the 1st of July 2026, the concessional contributions cap sits at $32,500 a year. That's what most people believe is the absolute limit they can put into super at the lower tax rate. But if your total super balance is under $500,000 and you haven't used your full cap in the last 5 years, that unused space doesn't disappear. It carries forward year after year, sitting there waiting for you to use it. Add it up, and someone who's been under the cap for 5 years running could be sitting on more than $100,000 of unused contribution room they didn't know they had. That's not a loophole, and it's not some clever trick an advisor dreamed up. It's a rule the ATO built specifically for people who couldn't contribute much in their 30s and 40s, when the mortgage and the kids and everything else came first, and are trying to catch up now that things have settled down. I've watched that happen with someone close to me. They assumed the cap was fixed, no exceptions, until they realized 5 years of unused carry-forward space could offset a $30,000 capital gains tax bill from selling an investment property. They felt a bit foolish afterwards, mostly because nobody had ever mentioned it to them. Not their fund, not their accountant, nobody. If that sounds like it might apply to you, the carry-forward balance sits right there on the ATO section of your MyGov account. It takes a couple of minutes to check, and it tells you exactly how much unused space you're carrying, right down to the dollar. But say you don't have a spare $100,000 sitting around to tip into super. That's fine. Most people don't, and that's not what this next sign is about anyway. Even using a fraction of that unused space, say $10,000 or $15,000 in a year you happen to have extra cash on hand, still lowers your taxable income while topping up the balance that eventually funds your retirement. That's where the work bonus paradox comes in. And it changes how you should think about working part-time once you're already on the pension. The fourth sign is understanding something called the work bonus, because this is the one that trips up more retirees than almost anything else, usually without them realizing it's even happening. Take Susan. She's 67, already receiving the age pension, and she wants to pick up 2 days a week at a local boutique, which would bring in about $15,000 a year. On the surface, that sounds like a straightforward decision. Extra income, extra cushion, a bit more room to move each fortnight. But if Susan doesn't understand how the income test works, that extra income can quietly cost her more than she expects. Here's the mechanism. Once her earnings go over the pension income free area, her payment reduces by 50 cents for every dollar she earns above it. Without knowing that, Susan could earn her $15,000 lose around $5,000 of her pension in the process, and effectively work those shifts for close to half the pay she thought she was getting. That's the trap. Not that working is a bad idea, but that working blind can quietly undo the benefit. Now here's the part that changes the whole picture. The work bonus means the first $300 of her fortnightly income from work is exempt from that income test altogether. Across a full year, that's $7,800 she can earn from work without her pension dropping by a single cent. And if she hasn't used her work bonus in previous fortnights, unused amounts build up in a bank, letting her earn even more before the taper kicks in at all. To put the pension itself in context, the maximum single-age pension sits at around $31,223 a year. For someone relying on that as a base income, an extra $7,800 completely untouched by the taper is not a small addition. It's close to a 25% lift in total income, just from understanding one rule most people have never heard of, let alone been told to check. This is what working smarter looks like in retirement. Not avoiding work altogether, and not diving into it blind either, but knowing exactly where the line sits before you take the shift, so the hours you put in actually stay in your pocket, instead of quietly disappearing back into the system. Understanding that is one thing. Actually bringing yourself to spend the money once it's sitting there in your account is a completely different challenge, and it trips up more people than you'd expect, even people who did everything right on the way in. The fifth sign has nothing to do with numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about how you feel when your super balance starts going down instead of up, which for most people is a feeling they've never had to sit with before. After 40 years of watching that number climb, year after year, contribution after contribution, the first time you make a real withdrawal, it can feel like something has gone wrong. Like you're doing the opposite of what you spent your whole working life training yourself to do. That feeling is completely normal. You've been conditioned to accumulate, not to spend. Nobody teaches you how to switch that off just because you've reached a certain age or a certain birthday. So if you felt a small pit in your stomach the first time you pulled $5,000 out of your own super, you're not being irrational. You're just running into a habit that took decades to build, and a few months of withdrawals won't undo that overnight. The shift that actually helps is reframing what that balance represents. It's not a scorecard measuring how well you did in life. It's a prepaid income stream, money you already earned and set aside specifically so you could spend it later, during exactly this stage of life, not some later stage that keeps getting pushed back. I remember a neighbour of mine, a retired tradie, who had around $800,000 in super and still wouldn't fix a leaking roof, because he didn't want his balance to drop below that figure. On paper, he was doing well. In reality, he was living in a damp house over a number he'd decided mattered more than his own comfort. Being rich in retirement isn't just about the size of the balance. It's about whether you can actually use it for the life it was meant to fund. The final sign isn't about your bank balance at all. It's about how you handle the one thing that can undo decades of careful saving in a single bad year. The sixth sign is understanding something called sequence risk, and it's one of the least talked about dangers in retirement planning, mostly because it only shows up at the worst possible moment. Here's the mechanism. A 20% drop in the share market during your first year of retirement does far more damage than the exact same 20% drop happening 10 years earlier, while you were still working and adding to your balance. Why? Because once you're retired and drawing down for living expenses, you're selling shares while prices are down just to cover groceries and bills, locking in losses that a portfolio 10 years from retirement would have plenty of time to recover from. Think back to 2008, during the global financial crisis. Anyone who retired right around then and was forced to sell shares near the bottom of that crash just to fund everyday expenses often never fully recovered their original portfolio value, even years later, once the market bounced back. Not because their investment choices were bad, but because of the timing of when the drop happened relative to when they needed the money most. Someone who retired a decade earlier and rode out the same crash while still working never had to sell a single share at the bottom, and their balance simply recovered on its own timeline. This is where a cash buffer earns its place. Something like 2 years of living expenses, roughly $100,000 for a couple, held in cash rather than shares, acts as a shock absorber for exactly this kind of situation. When the market drops, you draw from that cash instead of selling shares at a loss, and you give your share portfolio time to recover before you have to touch it again. Retirees who end up comfortable rarely just own shares and hope for the best. They hold a buffer specifically so a bad year in the market never forces their hand and never turns a temporary dip into a permanent loss they can't undo. So how do all 6 of these signs come together into something you can actually act on? Retiring rich in this country was never really about hitting some enormous number like $2 million. Based on everything we've covered, it comes down to a much shorter list, and none of it requires a windfall or a lucky break. Knowing your real pension sweet spot, instead of chasing a headline figure from a calculator built for someone else's situation. Clearing friction debt without giving up the compounding inside your super. Using the carry forward rule if your balance and circumstances allow for it. Understanding the work bonus. So part-time work doesn't quietly cost you money you never meant to give back. Getting comfortable with actually spending what you saved, instead of guarding it like a trophy. And holding a cash buffer so a bad year in the market never forces your hand. None of these 6 signs require you to have earned a huge income over your life. They require understanding how the pieces fit together, and most people over 55 have simply never had anyone walk them through it properly, because most advice out there is written for people decades younger. If you want to make sure you're not leaving pension money sitting on the table, hit subscribe. I'm Bob, and I'll see you in the next one.